Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. I'm Bob Ellis, and I chair the Rev 250 Advisory Group. We are a consortium of 75 organizations in Massachusetts planning commemorations of the beginnings of American independence. And our guests today are Abby Chandler. Abby's been on the podcast before. She's also a member of the Massachusetts 250 mission. She is the editor of HNet's Remembering the Revolution at 250 collection, which is what we'll be talking about today, Associate Professor of History at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell. Thanks, Abby, for coming back. And Marianne Holdscomb, who is an Associate Professor of History at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. Her big book is Remembering John Adams, the Second President in History, Memory, and Popular Culture, now working on a book about historical
Did he freeze?
memory at historical sites, focusing on based on a true story, remembering the American Revolution through film. So thank you both for coming on. Abby, why don't you tell us a bit about the HNet project of remembering the American Revolution at 250?
Okay, so this is a project that started to come about around 2 years ago. Early America is one of the more active of the various HNet networks, and I'm one of the two review editors there, along with Patrick Luck, and then Darcy Fryer is our collective all-round expert at everything else. And we were approached by a member of the HNet board to suggest that since we were coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the start of the American Revolution, that we think about creating a journal that would be published on the HNet platform. And so those are our origins. And we started out by talking about what we wanted to look at with this journal. And we eventually came up with 5 different categories: global revolution, looking at the revolution as a global war; texts of revolution, looking at the documents that came out of this period, how people have interpreted them over time; revolution or not, looking at loyalists in all their forms; remembering revolution, looking at how we have remembered the revolution over the last 250 years; and finally, revolution for a new century. Where is teaching the American Revolution going in the next couple of years? And we've had conversations with some of the scholars we're working with. If you don't quite perfectly fit into one category, that is just fine. We do have some papers that draw from a couple of the categories, but we thought by having those categories, it was a way of thinking about all of the different ways in which we are remembering the revolution and how we might go about doing that.
So there's certainly a lot there. And how long do you project that this series will be going, or that this journal will be running? Until the 300th, maybe?
So our plan is to definitely go on publishing at least through 2026. After that, we have not made any definite decisions. So we will see where we are in 2026.
It's one of the exciting things that happened with the bicentennial is a lot of new scholarship came out. So this seems like a good way to showcase what's coming out now about the revolution in these different ways.
That's also what we were thinking. And because we're publishing on HNet, it is an open access journal.
Mm-hmm.
You do not have to have a subscription. You do not have to have access to JSTOR. So we wanted the articles to be open to everyone, but also in looking to scholars, we have spent as much time talking to people working in museums. We're also talking to people who are teaching at the K through 12 level. And our goal, again, was as much as anything to create a document of who is doing interesting things to the revolution right now.
Right, right. We're talking with Abby Chandler, who is the editor of H-Net's Remembering the Revolution at 250 collection, and Marian Holtzcomb, who has written the first article in it based on a true story, Remembering the American Revolution Through Film. It's a great article, Marian, because it does talk about one of the issues we've been kicking around. There aren't any really good movies about the revolution, and you've found some movies you talk about in some detail. One process for choosing what you would talk about in the article?
Well, it was a little difficult to decide on the films. I wanted to start early and found this 1940s film, The Howards of Virginia, that I had seen years ago and remembered the cameo appearance
Mhm.
by Thomas Jefferson. And I thought, well, this is an interesting place to start. The
Mhm.
whole idea of the paper came about because I did have a professor who once said, why aren't there any good movies about the American Revolution? And I wasn't sure at that point that I agreed with him about that.
Mhm.
But yeah, the numbers are pretty slim when it comes to really
Yes.
good films about the Revolution. And Abby was a great help in directing me toward Mary Silliman's War because I
Right.
had not been familiar with that. I guess I went through school before that film was something that was used in the classroom.
Mhm.
So it was nice to include that one as well.
Yes. It's an interesting film. And you make the point that good history doesn't necessarily translate into good film.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, the problem with the American Revolution, one of them is that you don't have film, you don't have photographs,
Mhm.
and so you're trying to recreate a world.
Right.
What I've discovered in listening to the making of fill in the blank film is
Yes.
that they're always very proud about the costume details, the prop details, and showing off that, these were the actual buttons of a British soldier.
Yeah.
Got them exactly right. But
Yes.
the history doesn't always become a part of that. So the artifacts are great. And I think
Yes.
it's partly because the history is so big
Yes.
and the mythology has become so entrenched that it's
Mhm.
hard to tell a
Yeah.
good story sometimes.
That's true. But then we don't even do well with the mythology. I'm thinking about films like Spartacus and others about ancient Rome, ancient Greece, which are both exciting films. I don't know how good they are. I'm not an historian of ancient Greece or Rome, but
Yeah.
it's interesting. And you do talk about one film, Revolution, with Al Pacino, that apparently made him stop acting for a while. It was such a bad film. But
Yes.
Abby, have you seen Revolution?
I have seen Revolution. I saw it when I was in college, and I was a history major, was interested in the colonial period at that then as well. I definitely remember it caught a sense of the grittiness of the period, but I have to admit, my primary memory of it is a scene in which the heroine of the film is calling after the hero, you, only you. And my best friend and I were rather fond of reenacting that scene.
Oh,
And if that is your primary memory coming out of a film, you're not doing a whole lot with the revolution.
right. Yeah, my first sense of it when I saw the film was that I was watching something through a dream, and I got very disconcerted by that. But yeah, I think that was intentional because the grittiness is definitely there.
Mhm.
But Al Pacino constantly saying, this isn't my fight. This isn't my fight. This isn't my fight. And the reviewer who said even the characters don't know what's going on. I mean, it really, really got slammed. And I would be interested to know other people's take on the movie. I didn't care for it, but there may be people out there who really saw something in it that
Mhm.
that worked for them.
Yes. Jonathan tells us information you will. Jonathan was an extra in the Patriot.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed part of that.
I'm sorry. My audio connection is going in and out.
Okay.
Fix this. I'm just going to take a second to switch. Since we're not live, we can do this.
Okay.
My apologies.
I can edit this out post-production.
Thank
Just
you.
so you're aware.
Okay.
Yeah, I do have to say, Bob and I have had this conversation before, and I just watched April Morning for the first time in a long time, and I'd forgotten. Yeah, that wasn't a terribly good one.
No. I mean, as a coming of age story, it works pretty well, but it's pretty predictable too.
I do. So I worked for a while for the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, and I was always struck by Esther Forbes's work on Johnny Tremaine,
Yeah.
and how that still really holds in the public imagination.
Yes.
Hey, Bob.
Hello. Let me just see if
So
I can get back to.
I'm gonna take your computer image out.
Thank you.
Let's see, remove from stage. There we go. All right, and I will let you continue on.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay. My apologies. So we've talked about the revolution. We've talked about the Patriot. Where do we pick up then? Unless we wanted to have more to say about each of those.
Yeah, just a word about the Patriot. The Patriot is one of those where they're very proud about getting the props right, the costumes right. The history is a little problematic, and it's a film that it's enjoyable to watch. It's a nice action adventure film. It gets your attention. But some of the history is pretty disturbing in that one. And I had a student once talking about the Patriot, and he called it Braveheart in the colonies.
Right.
As if Mel Gibson just makes the same movie over and over again. He just moves around geographically. So I'm not sure that's completely fair, but there are some interesting problems with that film.
Yes. Yeah. You also talk about a film, Sweet Liberty, which is about the making of historical films. You have this historian played by Alan Alda, and he's written a novel, and then it's being turned into a film, which becomes really a whole story about, and screw historical accuracy is one of the taglines in the film.
Right. I debated whether to include that film because it's not actually about the American Revolution, but I thought that it tapped into a lot of the issues that historians have with the making of films like this.
Right.
And it wasn't as popular as some of Alan Alda's other films, but I think that tagline, as you said, "Screw historical accuracy," is key to what's going on in that movie. And watching Alan Alda's character just become increasingly frustrated, and the many different ways he tries to get the history right until finally he just rebels himself, and takes the reenactors along with him, is just a beautiful way to demonstrate that when historians watch films about history, we become frustrated when the story gets twisted, when the drama that was already there becomes overblown, or it becomes a vehicle for something else, for some agenda.
Right. Now, Marianne, I have to ask, since you are the authority on John Adams and the memory of John Adams, what thoughts you have about the John Adams series based on David McCullough's book?
On the surface, I like the miniseries very much. I thought Paul Giamatti was very good in capturing John Adams over a series of years. I wrote an entire chapter on this miniseries as well as the McCullough biography.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the takeaways in really diving deep into that miniseries was sort of the one-dimensional John Adams that we see coming from Paul Giamatti. He was clearly working from a script, but John Adams could be a very warm person. He loved deeply. He loved his friends.
Mm-hmm.
He had an incredible sense of humor that comes out in his diary and his correspondence.
Oh, yeah.
And all of that was missing from the character. And I was interested to find out when I visited the Adams National Historical Park in Quincy that the interpreters there agreed with me. They said they were very disappointed that part of John Adams did not emerge in the miniseries. So it's beautifully done. I praise Paul Giamatti and Laura Linney both. For the work that they did. But they were only given so much. And even things that McCullough covered don't show up in the script. And I understand they were limited. It couldn't be a 20-part series, although I would have been okay with that.
Sure. We all would have been,
But still, that one-dimensional, and it's sort of a trope that has gone through. There's a pattern, what I call obnoxious and disliked trope that comes from 1776.
Yes.
Sort of works through all of the depictions we've had of John Adams. And I would love to see a more three-dimensional, four-dimensional look at him, to find all of his personality.
Right. I think that's one of the things that McCullough does capture a lot of that. He started off to write a book about Jefferson, then he thought I'll add Adams, and then found out Adams was a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
And as he is, and if you notice reading the book, virtually every paragraph ends in John Adams's voice. And his way of writing and speaking, and it's fascinating. And another character who is one-dimensional in our historical memory is Washington. Maybe that's one reason it's hard to translate him to film.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And Washington didn't leave us nearly as much as John Adams did. John Adams is the dictionary definition of transparency. He just lays it all out there, and you've got a lot to work with there. Washington and Jefferson both played things pretty close to the chest there. So there's a lot that we have to guess at, a lot of assumptions that we have to make.
And you also talk about 1776, both the musical and the play. And that's a curious one because it's not about a battle. It's about this basically debate in Congress. And I've had students who tell me, when I say, I don't think there are good movies about the revolution, they say, well, what about 1776? It's kind of heartening to hear that.
Yes. Yeah. I know that some people who specialize in some of the other characters in that movie aren't as fond of it as I am. Like, I've heard people who study Richard Henry Lee get very upset with that movie, and I understand that completely. But when it comes to the characterization of John Adams in particular, especially in that period of time, probably the most intense of his life, William Daniels is brilliant, and the script is brilliant there, I think. And so you throw in some singing and dancing, It's okay. You have to allow for that. But the nuance is there. And I think also, even though there are some funny moments and we humanize the founders in that movie, there's also a respect there. And I don't want to say reverence so much. That sounds sacred. But I think, especially in the closing moments of the film, you see this respect for these people and what they do and the sacrifices they've made at this point, which comes through in the film.
Yes. We're talking with Marian Holtzcomb, author of Based on a True Story, and Abby Chandler, who is editing the HNet series on Remembering the Revolution at 250. Two films you didn't mention. I'm not criticizing you. I know you had a choice that were Johnny Tremaine and Guns Along the Mohawk, which both are revolutionary. Johnny Tremaine, it's maybe before your time and definitely before Abby's time, but a lot of kids grew up seeing that as their first real exposure to the revolution. I know you've written about the Disney version of history, so maybe you've covered it already there.
Yes. Yeah, I did. I covered Johnny Tremaine in that particular chapter in that edited volume. And my first or second draft of this article, Abby may remember, I did have a paragraph or two on Johnny Tremaine.
Mm-hmm.
When we decided to sort of refocus, I felt that I needed to take Johnny Tremaine out, and I didn't really want to,
Mm-hmm.
but there was a word limit
Yeah.
as well that I was working under. And I decided to really focus on some of these other films rather than just have a paragraph here on this one, a paragraph there on
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So, but
That makes sense. And I also applaud you for not simply rehashing what you've already said somewhere else.
thank you. Yeah, I certainly did not want to do that. But I think Johnny Tremaine is interesting. I've never read the original novel, but I have seen the movie several times, and it is one of those. It's also a coming of age story,
Right.
which is huge in revolutionary plays and novels, and it seems to be a theme because we were coming of age too, I guess, as a nation or something, and so you see this parallel a lot. But I've wondered since I've started working on this project, and I was looking at the historiography, if maybe a full-length book might be in order to kind of cover all of these things without me rehashing things that I've already done and other people have already done. I'm still thinking about that, and I'm going to ask Abby's advice on that as well.
And Abby, what other projects do you see coming up, and what next topics will you be tackling in the HNet series?
So we actually have one essay that's in layout right now. So it's going to be coming out. It's probably 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks at the longest. And this is actually the first of 2 essays in the Revolution for a New Century category. And it's written by 3 scholars who are affiliated with the Old North Church in Boston. And the original essay that they sent us was looking at how their interpretation of the revolution and of the community around the Old North Church in the 18th century, or how their interpretation of that community has evolved over time. And we eventually decided that it would work better as 2 essays. So the first essay that we'll be publishing in the next couple of weeks is a history of the Old North Church in the 18th century, which is particularly focused on the very multicultural, multiracial community that were part of that congregation. And we decided that because that's a story that's not usually associated with the Old North Church, that we wanted to give people that back history. And then the second essay, which we'll be publishing early in 2025, looks at how their interpretation has evolved.
Interesting.
So, yes. So that's what we have immediately coming. The other thing we have coming along is a series of essays looking at the experiences of loyalists. And that collection is near and dear to my heart because I am a loyalist scholar, but did not come about because of that particular interest of mine. We just kept getting proposals for loyalists. And maybe that may be people looking at, okay, the lead editor is a loyalist scholar, so maybe this is a journal that's interested in loyalists. but the first of those essays we'll be publishing is one looking at Loyalists and memory in the United States. We're also working with a scholar based in Canada on Loyalists and memory in Canada. We're working with one based in the UK because the Loyalists become the Loyalist diaspora. We really wanted to look at, well, how do other people in other countries remember that particular group of people? So that gives you a sense of where we are headed.
That's interesting. And it is, I think the study of loyalists is picking up, maybe because we recognize now the complexity and the shift in the ambiguous alliances. I mean, the prevailing idea here was that everyone was on the same side, when we know that actually this was really a contested story at the time, which the Patriot kind of says, although the bad guys really are the bad guys.
Right.
But it is these choices people are making is an interesting theme in the revolution.
Right.
And one of the things these essays are getting at is the choices people are making are not necessarily for political reasons. The British Army has done Moore's proclamation. If you are an enslaved African American and you belong to a patriot family and you run away and join the British Army, you will be set free. And the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia has an exhibit about those people, which has this really it's a diorama, and above it, it reads, "Sometimes freedom wore a red coat."
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. This, and Marion, in a couple of the films you mentioned, there is this reluctant warrior. I didn't want to go to war, but
Right.
And that's certainly here. And people are making this choice for a lot of reasons aside from having read Thomas Paine. That is, it's something else. In South Carolina, you never really liked your neighbors, or they raided your house and raped your wife and burned your barn. These kinds of things, which whatever side you're on, that is going to turn you away from whoever is doing that.
Right. And I think it gets back to the saying, all politics are local. How, depending on what is happening to you right now in your place with your neighbors, determine a lot. And I've thought for a long time that it would be nice in revolutionary scholarship if we could come up with some different terms to refer to people. Patriot is pretty loaded. And do we say that people who were loyal were patriotic? I don't think that's fair. I wish we could come up with some different ways to refer to these people, but I'm not sure that's going to happen anytime soon.
No, it may be too. Why you make the case that some of the television adaptations have done better than the film, and maybe that's because you have a smaller scale there, where you can have these smaller moments where someone is making this choice on TV as opposed to on the big screen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think overall television has done a better job with this, and that includes PBS. I mean, they have obviously come up with some really good things lately. I would be interested, as I was writing this piece, the Ben Franklin series came out on Apple TV.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen it yet, so I can't really judge what that's like. I know, being a John Adams scholar, I'm probably not going to be hugely happy with his depiction. But being reminded that it's from Franklin's perspective. So
right. So Franklin doesn't come across very well in McCullough's book either.
Right. No. Oh no, he does not. So it's all about perspective and perception there. But I think overall, if you look at the television offerings, there's at least a much more thoughtful way of looking at some of these things, because yes, you are touching on the smaller moments, and you're getting the intimate conversations about why people are doing what they're doing.
I can just share a story about the making of John Adams. And Jeff McCullough is a very good friend. This is David McCullough's son, and he went to be an extra in the filming of John Adams. You may know this. He didn't tell anyone in the family, but he went down to Williamsburg, signed up, and he is in the jury during the trial of the soldiers. And he's sitting there in the front on the jury box in costume, and Paul Giamatti is getting ready. He's pacing back and forth in front of the jury, getting ready for his scene. And all of a sudden he stops in front of Jeff, turns to him and says, "Tell your dad I'm not going to F this up." And then goes off.
Oh, I love it. I do love it.
And I guess he didn't. So,
No.
but yeah. So you also, and in your discussion of Mary Silliman's War, you also talk about that ambiguity, and that is also a film that's made for a smaller moment.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Abby, do you were much more familiar with Mary Silliman's War than I was, and I appreciated being guided there because I had not seen it.
So I first saw that film in college, again, as a history major. It was a class on the American Revolution taught by the professor who also taught classes on women in American history. And she used it in class. And I remember being very struck by it. And then years later, I had become a professor, which was not something I ever thought I would do. And I was teaching a class in the American Revolution for the first time and thought, oh, I remember liking that.
Mm-hmm.
And I tracked it down. What I did not realize at the time when I was in college was that my professor who assigned it at the time, Mary Silliman's War had only just been made a year or two before.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very new movie at that time.
Yeah.
And so rewatching it 2 decades later, one of the things that struck me was that it felt as fresh as it did when I saw it as a college student in the early 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a wonderful website called Frockflix, which specializes in critiquing historical clothing in period film. And one of the points they make is that you can often date a film by the hairstyles. That the hairstyles will often reflect what's going on in whatever era it is. And Mary Silliman's War is one of those rare films where you watch it and you can't quite tell when it was made. I mean, okay, yes, the production values at this point, but otherwise, it really has a very timeless feel. It is not tied to the decade in which it was produced.
Right.
I think is one of the things that Marianne really got at with her essay is how much each of these films in the Revolution reflect the periods in which they were made. So yes, I wish Mary Silliman's War was better known. And as both of you have said, I think it really does get at the nuances of the decisions that people are making in a small community.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I really liked about it is that you often hear about the quote unquote patriot loyalist divide in the South. You don't hear a lot about that happening in New England.
Right.
And Mary Silliman's War is in Connecticut. So that's one of the things I found really interesting about that film. And her story is that it's New England where you're seeing these clashes happening as well.
Right. Another piece that it gets is the role of religion. That is, the pastor is her counselor, and that this is a big part of her choice. And you're right. You also make the point about the Patriot doesn't cover that intensity of the loyalist feeling in South Carolina the way Mary Silliman's War does of what's happening here among really ordinary people.
Yeah, and the Patriot clearly wanted to concentrate on good American bad English.
Yeah.
And making the English the villains. So if you have that tension between Americans, you can't really go there. You can't tell that story. And the other interesting aspect of that is if you look at something like Disney's The Swamp Fox,
Yeah.
you get a very different message.
Mhm.
You see that tension between Americans in a Disney television show. You don't
Yeah.
in The Patriot. Really,
It's fascinating. And about 20 years earlier, too, they captured that.
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Well, I think, Mel Gibson hates the British Empire, so that's kind of a running theme of his film.
That's another pattern, definitely. Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, thank you. We've been talking with Abby Chandler, a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, who's editing HNET's Remembering the American Revolution at 250 collection. And the first issue has just dropped free online at HNET for anyone to read, based on a true story, Remembering the American Revolution through Film, which Marianne Holtzcomb from Kennesaw State University has written. And Marianne's written other things. And Marianne's also doing a new book on place and the revolution. So we'll have to have you back to talk about that at some point. So thank you both for joining us. It's been fun talking to you. And
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
let me thank Jonathan Lane, our producer, our man behind the curtain. And I want to thank our listeners. Every week we thank folks in different places who are tuning in regularly. And we have folks actually all over the world tuning in. So this week, if you're in one of these places and want some of our Revolution 250 swag, send Jonathan an email, jlane@revolution250.org. And by the way, it's just occurring to me how appropriate it was that we found someone named Jonathan to be the director of Revolution 250. So folks in Leawood, Kansas, and Santa Rosa and San Francisco in California, Queens, New York, Hamilton, New Jersey, places between and beyond. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston. Thank you.